Well, memory is kind of an interesting thing. We can hold decades and decades of information. Like I can remember songs from years and years ago. I can remember random movie lines. But if my wife asked me to pick up 3 things from the grocery store, she just knows to text me. Like we've all seen how this goes and how this ends. It's just better that way. It just works out that way. Because my memory just can't hold that much information, which sounds strange. But forgetting isn't really even the strangest part of memory that I think. I think one of the strangest parts of memory is when we remember something or we think we remember something correctly, and then we find out, no, we did not remember that correctly. And there's a name for this. It's called the Mandela effect. It's when large groups of people all remember the same thing, and yet they're totally incorrect. So here's an example. One of the most famous lines from a movie from Star Wars is when Darth Vader says, "Luke, I am your father." Except that's not the line. The line is, "No, I am your father," right? So all the Star Wars fans in here were about to go to battle with me. I was feeling a disturbance in the force there. But that is the line. The second one is the actual line. Now, another example is the game Monopoly. Yeah, everyone knows Monopoly, one of the most frustrating games that'll take you 16 hours to bankrupt your friend. But picture the logo, the Monopoly man. He's got the top hat, the mustache, the walking cane, and an eyeglass, like a monocle, doesn't he? Well, he doesn't actually have the monocle. And apparently, a lot of people remember him having that, but he never had that. You're thinking of Mr. Peanut. He has a monocle. As far as I'm aware, he still and always has had that. And now some of you are going to probably pull out your phones and be fact-checking these throughout the rest of the sermon. That's okay. If I see you on your phone, that's what I'll be thinking. But that's kind of what makes memory so strange, right? Is that we can sort of remember things in a different way. You know, we forget things, but we can also just misremember or think something happened in a different way than what it did. And so today I want us to take a look at what we commonly refer to as the Great Commission. It is a pretty well-known passage, but today I want us to think about it in a different way. I want us to think about it in this way. Picture it as the Great Omission from the Great Commission. Because I think there's 3 things in the Great Commission that we have sort of forgotten, or we have sort of misremembered how it really was supposed to go and how it was supposed to be. And so let's read it together. Let's all refresh our memories, and then we'll go through it. So here it is. This is in Matthew chapter 28, and I'm going to pick it up with verse 16, and you'll see it up on the screen as well. Here's what it says. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." Now, to set the scene, this is after the crucifixion. Now, Jesus has been come back to life. He is resurrected now. And these are some of the final words that we get from Jesus. In fact, these are the final words that Matthew records Jesus saying. And if you notice this passage, right away, there are some omissions in this passage. Did you catch it? So there's 11 disciples, not 12. Like we're already down one, right? It says that they're in Galilee, not Jerusalem. You might expect it to be somewhere more significant like Jerusalem. And then it says that they worshiped, but some doubted or they hesitated a little bit. And so everything looks a little bit smaller, a little bit shakier than we might expect after Jesus resurrects and comes back to life. But notice that Jesus does not begin with their weakness. I want us to just kind of notice that right at the beginning, that the Great Commission does not rest on the greatness of the disciples themselves. The Great Commission rests on Jesus Christ and his authority and his reign. And so that brings us to this first omission. And I think this is an interesting one because we'll just call it the omission of authority. The omission of authority. See, because we usually begin the Great Commission with those words, go and make disciples. But notice that Jesus begins one verse earlier. I think that's one we tend to skip over. He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So the Great Commission does not start with the activity of the church. It starts with the authority of Jesus Christ. And so before it's even a missionary command, it's like a royal announcement that is happening here. And so we often read this as though Jesus is launching this great recruitment strategy for this new movement or this new religion, but that's not what's happening in this passage, because it's a lot bigger than that. In fact, this passage is more like a coronation announcement for a king than it is about anything else. It's saying that the crucified Jesus is alive. He's standing on a mountain, and he's announcing that he reigns. Notice how Jesus says it. He says, all authority, what? Has been given to me. He's already has it. It's been handed to him by someone who had the authority to hand it to him. And it's important to know that like kings in the ancient world, there was kind of a pattern. Not everyone did it the same way, but there is kind of a pattern in the ancient world of how kings would receive power. It would carry this kind of pattern. The ruler would receive authority, then he would announce his reign publicly, and then he would send representatives out into his kingdom to tell them that he is now ruling and reigning and that they have commands to obey this new king. And so when we kind of overlay that pattern onto this passage in Matthew 28, well, we find some striking parallels to that. So verse 18 is like his enthronement announcement. He says, all authority has been given to me. Then in verses 19 and 20, it's like this commission. Jesus sends his representatives to go out and do something, and that is to make disciples and to teach them to obey. And so this is not Jesus just asking 11 men to sort of just help him launch this movement. That's not what's happening. The king is announcing that he is ruling and he is reigning. And the Bible has been building towards this exact moment for hundreds and hundreds of years. To give just one example, back in the book of Daniel, about 600 years before Jesus stood and said these words, the prophet Daniel records a really interesting prophecy. Here's what he says. This is from Daniel chapter 7. He says, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. What I want you to notice is if we did a quick comparison with what Daniel says and with what Jesus just said, you're going to see some really, really interesting overlap. So for example, Daniel just said he was given authority. Well, what did Jesus just say? He just said all authority has been given to me. Daniel says that all nations and peoples of every language, and then Jesus says, yeah, we're going to make disciples of all the nations. Daniel says his dominion will be everlasting. It'll just keep going. And then Jesus ends the Great Commission and he says, I am with you everlastingly. I'm with you all the time, forever, until the end. And even that term, Son of Man, we just read that in Daniel 7. Here's an interesting thing. Did you know that probably Jesus' favorite way to refer to himself was to call himself the Son of Man? Throughout Matthew's gospel, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man 30 times. To give you just one example, when Jesus is on trial and he's before the high priest and the religious leaders, they say this, they ask him, they say, hey, if you're the Messiah, if you're the Son of God, tell us. And note how Jesus answers that. I'll just read it to you. This is from Matthew 26. He says, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And the response from the religious leaders in that moment was they tore their clothes. They called that blasphemy because they knew exactly what Jesus was claiming in that moment. And that was one of many things that Jesus said that got him put to death. But Jesus said it anyway because it's the truth and because he really is that Son of Man from Daniel chapter 7. And now that same Jesus stands alive on this mountain, and he announces that Daniel's vision has become a reality. Like he is this crucified and rejected Son of Man that has been vindicated and has risen from the dead, and now he is the king who has received his kingdom. And what's interesting is that mountains throughout the Bible, but also in the Gospel of Matthew, mountains are really, really important and significant things happen there. So for example, Jesus' most famous sermon is the Sermon on the, thank you, mountain, right? The transfiguration of Jesus happens on a, come on, let's go, yes. And the temptation of Jesus, well, part of it happens on a, thank you. And that one's interesting. Here's why that one's interesting. Is because Satan shows Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, and he says, Jesus, if you will bow down to me, I'll give you all these kingdoms. And Jesus, we know, absolutely refuses that. But now we get to the end of Matthew's gospel, and now Jesus rightfully receives his kingdom. And so I want you to notice also the scope of Jesus' authority here. Jesus reigns, he says, over the spiritual realm and also the physical realm. He says heaven and earth. Everything visible and invisible falls under the reign of Jesus Christ. And so now I hope that maybe you're starting to see why this omission really matters to catch. Remember in verse 17, we saw that the disciples worshiped him, but it says that some doubted. And Jesus doesn't start with telling them how great they are. He doesn't start by trying to build them up or tell them how capable they are. He tells them who he is. And that's important to catch. Because I think the disciples needed to hear that this Jesus is the true king. And I think we need to hear that too. Because most of us are comfortable thinking that Jesus is kingly. He's king-like. I mean, like, we're okay with Jesus being the king over salvation, over like our church services, over worship. We're okay with that kind of stuff. But Jesus says he's king over like everything visible and invisible, which means that he's king over our work. He's king over our money, over our relationships, over our ambitions, over our future. Jesus is king over all of those things. And I think that's where a little of the disconnect starts in our minds. Is he really the king over all of those things? Would we live our lives in that kind of reality? And some of you just hear the word authority and your shoulders might tense up a little bit. I understand that. Because you may have watched authority in your life really do some damage and maybe used as a weapon. Maybe you had a boss or a parent, or maybe even it was a church who used authority or used power to take something from you. And so what you need to hear in this moment is what kind of king, what kind of authority are we dealing with here? So you need to hear this, is that Jesus doesn't use his authority to take from you. Jesus uses his authority to give himself for you. This is the kind of king that we're dealing with. So earthly rulers have no problem sacrificing others for themselves. This King Jesus will sacrifice himself for others. So it's a different kind of king. And I think when we forget that, Jesus becomes more like a consultant than a king. A consultant is someone you can listen to. You might even say they've got a lot of good things to say. But you can kind of turn it off when you're ready to turn it off, right? When it encroaches on something that you want to retain the authority over, we can turn off the consultant or get rid of that consultant. And so I think once the authority of Jesus is reduced, Christianity becomes something you can edit and make into what you want it to be. And so we start to fit Jesus into our lives instead of placing our lives under the rule and reign of Jesus. And so Jesus settles the question of authority first and foremost, because that's an important one to settle. But then he gives us the mission. And the mission is to make disciples of all the nations. And so let's go to our second omission. So the first omission, the omission of authority. Here's the second one, the omission of disciple making. And I'm just going to read the first part of verse 19 again. That famous line, Jesus says, therefore, go and make disciples of all nations. So we said once you remove or reduce the authority of Jesus Christ in the Great Commission, it starts to sound like the Great Suggestion. You can do it, but you don't have to do it. And suggestions are something that we can edit and manipulate to our own benefit. And so I think one way that we tend to edit or change what Jesus really said is we kind of miss what Jesus actually is commanding here, and we make it mean something a little different. So we tend to place a lot of emphasis on the word go. But the real emphasis, and grammatically the real emphasis, is make disciples. The verbs like going and baptizing and teaching, that all serves the main thrust command of make disciples. Now, I just brought grammar into a sermon, so you're gonna have to stay with me here. It would be like this if you told your child, for example, to go check on your sister. And the child goes, doesn't check on sister, and comes back and says, yeah, I went. You said go, I did the go part. You would say, well, I think you missed the thrust of the command there. Because the main command was to check on sister. Of course, you gotta go. It's kind of obvious that you have to go, but it's the checking that I really wanted you to do. And it's the same thing here. We could just go, but what are we going to do? Jesus is saying, you're going to make disciples. That's the emphasis that Jesus has there. And in the first century, what was a disciple? A disciple was like a student. It was someone who was a learner. It was someone who was like an apprentice. These would be words that hopefully give us a little more meaning to it. It's not merely someone who just collects information, just like head knowledge, although it would be part of that. It's someone who is learning to live a way of life from a master. Like they're learning to live the life that the master lives and model that. That's what a disciple was back then. And so the disciples, they didn't hear Jesus kind of offering like this opportunity to start a new religion. And I think that's sometimes what we hear in this passage. And that's not what Jesus was saying. It wasn't as if Jesus is putting together like a stellar sales team and he's like, Peter, you talk a lot so you can handle the pitch. John, you're kind of introverted, not sure what to do with you. Maybe you can help people like pray the prayer or something. I don't know what you're gonna do, right? It wasn't like that at all. And these guys weren't hearing that. They were hearing something different. And Jesus was not even saying, get this, Jesus was not even saying go and get people to pray a specific prayer. He was not saying go and hey, let's make sure people get to heaven when they die. He doesn't say that here, and that's important to emphasize. He says go and make disciples. And so what did those 11 men standing there think? I always think it's really important in the Bible to kind of sort of put ourselves into the shoes of the people who are hearing what Jesus said. So what were these disciples hearing when he said, go and make disciples? Well, to kind of paraphrase Jesus or to fill in some gaps, I think Jesus was saying something like this, like, hey guys, you know how the last 3 years I spent a ton of time with you. You saw me teach. You saw like every word I said. You saw how I treated people that no one wanted to touch. You saw how I handled people with grace and compassion, but hey, you also saw me say hard words to people when it was needed. And you saw me say truthful things even when it got me in a ton of trouble. You saw me do all of those things. In fact, I sent you out from time to time and then you came back and we talked about it and we tried to get through of like what happened and how did it work and what's gonna happen next. I kind of gave you all of those things and here's what I want you to do. I want you to do that same idea, that same thing with other people. I think that's a little closer to what the disciples would have heard because we have to remember the disciples spent 3 years being shaped and being formed by Jesus. And so they knew that disciple making was a process. It's not a moment in time. And so Jesus said, make disciples, but we often hear make converts. And I want to emphasize that this is an important clarification. Conversion is something that happens in an instant. Disciple making is something that happens over a period of time. So it's a little bit different. So the Great Commission is not the great conversion where we just simply call people to make a decision for Jesus. It's a call to make disciples or make learners, apprentices of this Jesus. And not just learners with head knowledge, it's people who live it out in their lives. And so I think one of the greatest omissions in the Great Commission is just that we have made disciple making optional when it's the main command that Jesus gave us. So we tend to treat disciple making as if it's this advanced track. Like if you're really weird and you really want to go a little further, then you're kind of in that realm. As if, Christianity has like a basic and a premium level, and you can opt into one or the other. I think we need to be careful and see, what did Jesus mean? Jesus treated disciple making as it. That was the thing. That was what Jesus was going for there. That is the normal Christian life, was to make disciples. And so conversion to Christianity often becomes the goal for us, but Jesus, get this and hear me clearly, Jesus treats conversion as like the starting line, and then discipleship happens from there. And so disciple making is the ultimate command. And so I have to say, we're not against conversion. We're not against that. So I know people are going to come up to me later, and no, I'm not against that. In fact, we have to share the gospel in order for people to even get on this disciple making pathway, don't we? And we love to hear when someone prays to accept Jesus. We're always going to celebrate that. But we just need to understand that it's important that that's the starting line, and disciple making is what happens from there. It's important for us to see that distinction. And so recognize the main command that Jesus is giving. It's to make disciples of the nation. So Jesus could have said it any number of ways, couldn't he? Jesus could have done this whole Christianity thing in a number of different ways, but he chooses this seemingly slow process of discipleship in order to bring about change in the world. And you need to know that these 11 doubting disciples, they absolutely changed the world. Remember, the early church had no political power, had no buildings, had no unified program or anything like that. Didn't have anything that we think of that we definitely need. The early church didn't have that, and yet they completely transformed the Roman Empire in that time period. There's a historian named Tom Holland, not the actor who plays Spider-Man, I know what you're thinking. There's different people named that. He's a historian, but he's not even a Christian, and he wrote a whole book on how Christianity absolutely turned the world upside down. Here's just one quote. He says, "Christianity may be the most enduring and influential legacy of the ancient world. In its emergence, the single most transformative development in Western history." And so maybe now you're thinking I don't know if I could do what these 11 guys did. I'm not cut out for that. But I want you to start thinking that disciple making is a lot more ordinary than you might think. And many of you are already doing it. So we need to understand that we think that it's this special thing, but let me give you an example, some options to consider. If I told you this, I said, hey, for the next 30 years of your life, here's option one. I want you to lead 10 people to know Jesus every year for the next 30 years. That's option one. So get that in your mind. 10 people a year for the next 30 years. That's one option. Here's your second option. Every year, I just want you to find 2 people. And you are just going to get together with them to read scripture, to build them up in it, what it looks like to follow Jesus. And then at the end of that year, you're going to tell them to do that same thing with 2 others after that. And let's say that pattern continued for the next 30 years. Every year, you're doing 2 more people, just meeting with them, walking them through what it means to be a Christian, what it means to follow Jesus. And then they go out and then they do that 2 by 2 every year from there. Well, you can probably do the math on example 1. What would that be? 10 people a year for 30 years, that's 300 people coming to know Jesus. That would be awesome. We would celebrate that. But consider option 2. Guess how many people that would be after 30 years? Some of you know how exponents work. It would be over 2 billion people would be discipled if you did it that way. So I think Jesus knew what he was talking about when he offers this idea of disciple making. Now we know math doesn't always work out perfectly. It's not always going to be 2. It's not always going to be 10. We understand that. We're just trying to compare how Jesus and why Jesus commanded it in this way. But let me ask you this. Which one of those two scenarios feels more manageable to you? Consider that second option that I talked about. If I said, everyone in here, I want you to pull out your phone and just text 2 people right now. And here's what you're going to say. You're going to say, hey, would you want to get together with me over the next year? And we're just going to get together once a week, about an hour. We're going to read scripture. We're going to talk about what it means to follow Jesus. We're going to pray for one another. And you know what? We're going to challenge each other to actually obey what Jesus told us to do. You want to do that? Doesn't that feel a little bit more manageable? I would actually say no matter where you're at in your walk with Jesus, anybody can do that. Listen, if you're a teenager in here, you could do that. If you're older than that, you've been a Christian for a long time, you could do that. That's very manageable. That's very, very easy to do, I think, in so many ways. And you can even do this with people who are just interested in following Jesus. Maybe you're saying, well, they're not quite there yet. Invite them into that. See where that goes. There's interest, so invite them into that and see what happens. So I want you to see that disciple making is a costly endeavor, and no doubt. It's going to cost us time. It's going to cost us patience. It's going to cost us a number of things. But I want you to just consider for a moment, what's the cost of non-discipleship? Like if we don't disciple, what's the cost? Well, some of the costs we can kind of see, right? We know people who have gone to church maybe their whole lives or for decades. They know all the Bible verses, they know all the stories, but yet they are ruled by anger in the home. Everyone who's close to them knows that they are just difficult people to be around because the anger just was never dealt with, but they know all the stories, right? Or it could be someone who sings about forgiveness on a consistent basis, but everybody who's close to them knows that they have never forgiven anybody for anything. Listen, that's the cost of non-discipleship if we don't help people take steps forward in their faith. So Jesus tells us to help people learn how to be with him, become like him, and do the sorts of things that he did. And that requires more than just teaching people information. That requires teaching people to obey what Jesus said. And that leads us to our third and final omission. So we have the omission of authority, number 1. Number 2, the omission of disciple making. And here's the third one, the omission of obedience. Jesus says he says, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Again, I want you to just notice his words. He does not say, teach them everything I have commanded. That would be good. But he doesn't say that. He says, teach them to obey everything I have commanded. And so the best way I could do this is just with an illustration. I think this will keep this point real short. If you tell your child to go clean their room, and you come back in an hour, room is not clean. And so, of course, you're going to go find your child and say, hey, what happened? And let's say your child answers in this way. Let's say they say this, oh, yeah, Dad, I heard what you said. You said clean your room. In fact, I memorized it. You said clean your room. I looked into the grammar. It was a great way to put that. And actually posted it on social media, and I got some likes and shares, and I just felt like I needed to put that out there. A lot of people needed to hear that. And, I was talking to my friends, and we were just trying to encourage one another about what it means to clean our rooms. And so we decided that this week on Thursday night, we're going to get together, and we're going to talk about what our lives could look like if we cleaned our rooms. There's going to be snacks. I'm so excited. I can't wait. It's going to be great. But no, I didn't actually clean my room. What? You could see the point really fast. You wouldn't accept that. You would say, I think we missed something here. Maybe you'd say something more than that, maybe. But that's not quite what you meant when he said to clean your room. And so I want to be clear. When we talk about obedience, I do want to be careful. I'm not saying that our obedience or that our faith rests on our obedience. That's not what I'm saying here. Please hear me. It rests on the obedience of Jesus Christ, of course. And so our hope is never that we have obeyed enough. And so don't hear me preaching perfection to you right now. Your hope is that Jesus is the one who obeyed fully. He died the death that we all deserve, and then he rose again as the King who does call us into a life of obedience. And so obedience does not earn your place as a disciple, but it is one of the clearest marks that you are a disciple, isn't it? Because disciples obey, not perfectly, In fact, I think some of the meaning behind this passage is that it's someone who is learning to obey. Remember, a disciple's a learner. You're learning to obey and what that looks like. And I think what's so important to see here right at the end is that Jesus doesn't send us out all by ourselves and just go learn it and goodbye. Notice those final words that Jesus says in this passage. He says, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. So the one who has all authority, the one who has all the authority over all the nations and teaches us to obey all that he commands, he will be with you all the days of our lives. And that should be an encouragement to us. Did you know that Matthew's gospel in chapter 1 opens with this phrase? It says that this Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. And then Matthew closes it with Jesus' words. It's almost as if Jesus is saying, that is right. I am with you. I'll be with you always. And what that means for us today and this morning is that it's no accident that you're here. It's no accident that Jesus promises to be with us all of our days. And it means that if you were to call upon the name of the Lord in faith, Jesus will be with you, even if you have some doubts here today. It means that you may have prayed a prayer a long time ago and you realize today, I don't know if I've been following him like he said to follow him. Listen, Jesus has all the grace and compassion in the world to welcome you back. And it means that if you see that maybe making disciples is not only sharing the gospel, but it is more than that, it's helping people see who Jesus is and to live out that life. Jesus will be with you every step of the way. And so as we close, I want to give us two responses here to think through. And I think the first is just two questions. One is, what am I omitting from the Great Commission? What's my omission from the Great Commission? You've heard these three different ways. I would just challenge us to just choose one thing. What is one thing that you feel like, hey, maybe I've forgotten this one. Maybe I wasn't living like this is the way it should be. Think about that. And second question is just this. What are the things that you would do if you actually believed that Jesus was with you every step of the way? What would you do differently? In what ways would you have more courage? In what ways would you take more risks because you knew that this Jesus, the King over everything visible and invisible, was walking with you? What kinds of things would you do if you really believed that? Let's take a moment here to respond to the Lord, and then I'll close us.